Welcome again to my lecture on the lure of the occult, esoteric motifs in fiction. This is the third part, and now come the really interesting part, because we go to actual novels and do case studies, seeing the development of those motifs and those kind of messages which we reviewed in the first two parts. I hope it's not going to be too long, because I'm going to talk about quite a number of novels. You also must understand that in this talk I restrict myself to Anglo-American fiction, but of course esoteric motifs have been present and have been very popular in basically all literature, European literature, written in various languages. But I think from the history of English and American literature we can see quite a good paradigm how Western esotericism has been permeating literary fiction. To begin the story, we have to go back to the early 19th century, to the time of Romanticism. This is the time when, after the period of Enlightenment and rationalism, the interest of Europeans turned back to the kind of lost and forgotten holistic world picture of the pre-modern period, and especially in literature, references to this period became quite popular and much discussed. The first example is a kind of emblematic novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, published in 1818. I'm not going to recount the story because it's pretty well known, especially from the film of Kenneth Branagh, which I find a very excellent filmic adaptation of this novel. I would only point out one motif. Frankenstein, who is trained as a doctor in Germany, and he's supposed to be a rationalist and approach medical problems on a rationalistic basis, at some point becomes dissatisfied with this very matter-of-fact scientific approach, and goes back to earlier philosophers, mostly 16th century philosophers, and reads Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, and von Helmont. These are three philosophers from the early modern period who were the kind of last great synthesizers of the occult world picture. Basically, Frankenstein is pushed back to an intellectual state when he's bordered between rationality and mysticism, and much of his ambitions and actions in the novel come from that. So the Renaissance occultism, or the Renaissance magic, is permeating and is present in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I would like to talk a little bit more about another example, which is also early 19th century, but it's a fascinating novel and much less discussed and as Shelley's Frankenstein. It is James Hogg's. James Hogg was a Scottish writer, and in 1824 he published a novel titled The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Now this is a pretty fascinating book, and also in its form it's interesting, because it's like a narrative which combines present 19th century stories with reflections back to the late 17th century. So basically the actual narrative starts in 1687, when a Scottish woman, Robina Ord, marries a much older gentleman, George Colvin, the laird of Dalcastle. This Robina doesn't very much like her husband, because the husband is a jolly good fellow in spite of his age. He's drinking, playing, and lives the life of the kind of lower Scottish aristocracy, while Robina is deeply religious, and she is very strongly under the influence of the Reverend Ringham, who is an extreme Calvinist. What happens that finally Robina leaves her husband, and apparently she delivers two sons. One is the son of the laird, and his name is George Colvin, and the other one is supposed to be the illegitimate child of the Reverend Ringham, and he will be called Robert Ringham. Now what happens later, that George goes to the capital and lives a similar life to his father. It's a very open and kind of lascivious life. And there he meets his brother. And his brother starts following him as a kind of a shadow. They get into various conflicts. And in the end of the first part of the novel, we learn that George is murdered. He's being stabbed in the back. The idea is that there was either a duel or some sort of a conflict in a pub, but finally we figure out that actually it was his brother Robert who killed him. This is the first part. Sorry, I take off my glasses because I need to look at my notes, and they are too close to me to use the regular glasses. So in the second part of the novel, we have a document published by the editor, and later on turns out that the editor is James Hogg. So there are some interesting tricks in the structuring and in the narration of the novel. And the second part is Robert's own account of life, mostly a manuscript which the editor publishes. And from this we learn that Robert was brought up among miserable circumstances by this extremely religious but apparently not so honest Reverend Ringham. Then appears a very strange character who calls himself a Jill Martin, apparently a kind of incarnation of the devil, and Robert gets under the influence of him. So in him a kind of split personality develops. On the one hand, he is convinced that as a Calvinist elect, whatever he does he will go to heaven, and on the other hand he's making a kind of a pact with this devil character. He gets more and more confused, basically mad. He's kind of swinging between despair and madness, and apparently finally kills his brother. And in the very last part of the novel, we come back to the present, which is the 19th century, and it turns out that James Hogg, as an editor, is publishing now this account, and there are some interesting fictions, that there are newspaper articles about the founding of the body and the grave. This manuscript was found in the grave of Robert, and things like that. So basically, what can we make out of this? Hogg obviously capitalized on the ideas of ghosts and created the literary archetype of the double, which will be a big topic in 19th century literature, enough to think of Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Jekyll and Dr. Hyde, the famous story. Another interesting feature of James Hogg's writing is that it's partly sarcastic. It presents a satirical image about these occult beliefs, but at the same time he manages to create an atmosphere that we cannot really absolutely disbelieve in these supernatural events and motivations, what we have there. Also, it's a kind of an early example of the modern crime fiction because of the investigation and the newspaper articles and the founding of the bodies and the exhumation of the graves and things like that. And in the autobiographical part, the story is told by the point of view of its criminal anti-hero, who is possessed by angels, possessed by demons, so he's a completely mad character. And this kind of an autobiographical narration of a mad person will also be very important in modern literature. We have a lot of examples in a lot of novels for that. So critics, especially recently, praise this novel very much, and very often come to the conclusion that this is a kind of an archetypal version or an archetypal form of a postmodern novel. The next example of the early models is another English novel by the 19th century, however from the second half of the 19th century, and this is A Strange Story by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, published in 1862. Bulwer-Lytton was a very popular novelist of the 19th century. He was also a politician and had a pretty varied life. And this novel is full of various esoteric moments and at the same time scientific moments. It clearly shows the kind of struggle of arguments between rationalism, scientific rationalism, and esoteric beliefs. An interesting feature of the novel is that it has a lot of footnotes, which is not very common in a novel. And in these footnotes, he is actually quoting scientific articles of his age, that is 19th century, views on electricity, on certain medical practices, on spiritism, and others. Now, on the slide, you can see the main characters. The leading character is Dr. Alan Fenwick, who is a small-town doctor, very kind of balanced person, absolutely rationalistically approaching scientific problems. He gets in touch with two esotericists. One is Sir Philip Derval, who is a white magician, and Julius Faber, who is a learned physician but deeply religious and not very far from esoteric ideas. All this happens in a small town, in a country town in England. All of a sudden a character turns up who is called Louis Grail, sometimes Margrave, and extremely charming, but later on it turns out that he is the representative of evil supernatural powers, and he seeks immortality. Now this is also a quite common motive, that the magician who grows old is looking for means of extending his life. One possibility is to find the elixir, somehow a magical potion which gives back youth, and another version, of course, is the Faustian route, that you make a pact with the devil and the devil will give your youth back. There's also Lillian Ashley, who is a beautiful, hypersensitive young lady in the town, and Dr. Fenwick is courting her, and already their wedding is kind of arranged, and they want to get married, when all of a sudden Lillian gets under the influence of this Louis Grail Margrave, the wicked character, who previously murders Sir Philip Derval, who could be a good intentioned opponent to him, and a kind of devilish fight unfolds in this little 19th century English town. Things get really extreme later on in the novel. Lillian gets hysteric, moves to the house of Margrave. Alan Fenwick liberates her, finally decides to take her to Australia, just to be as far as possible from Margrave. Margrave is growing old, and he is desperately trying to get back Lillian under his power, because for certain reasons that would give back his youth if he could suck the life out of the young lady. So he goes after the couple to Australia, and in the last part of the novel there is a kind of infernal, fiery, terrible fight between Fenwick and Margrave, in which Australian Aboriginal people are, and their magic is also involved. So it's extremely complex and pretty fascinating in many ways. Now, there are many references to the early modern occult world picture and famous characters from that period in the novel. For example, Paracelsus is mentioned, Simon Foreman, who was an English occultist in the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Swedenborg appears, the 18th century mystic, Swedish mystic, philosopher, Descartes. There are references to Middle Eastern magic. Margrave had his occult education in Arabia, and as I mentioned, even the Australian Aboriginal magic is a motive in the novel. Again, we can say that in many ways it prefigures a number of motives, a number of kind of stock characters which appear in later novels, and the whole structure of the novel is in some ways not absolutely alien from the fragmented and in a way full of paradoxes kind of postmodern novels. A much shorter and easier reading is a novel called The Magician by Somerset Maugham, the very, very popular English writer of the early 20th century. Maugham published this novel in 1908, and it recalls his experiences in the first years of the 20th century with the Paris intellectual milieu, and with a curious and strange Englishman in this milieu, who is not other than Aleister Crowley. Of course, anybody interested in modern magic is familiar with the name of Aleister Crowley, who called himself the Beast 666, and who reformed magic in such a way that it opened the gateway to modern Satanism as well. He was a seer, a visionary, he had encounters, spiritual encounters, but at the same time he was also a poet and a painter. So this is a very interesting, complex story. Apparently Maugham didn't have positive impressions about him when they were temporarily in the same company in Paris, and as it turns out, this was the inspiration for this novel. Now in the novel, again, we have a rationalistic kind of very quiet and firm character doctor, Arthur Burden, who is a surgeon, and he has a fiancée, Margaret Dauncey. Now the fiancée is more sensitive, more delicate, we could say hypersensitive person. This couple is very similar to the one described in the previous novel, in the Strange Story. Of course, they are in Paris and they meet, they got into the company of Oliver Haddo, who is the kind of literary adaptation of the character of Aleister Crowley. And Haddo completely brings Margaret under his influence, kidnaps her, takes her to his English castle. Arthur Burden doesn't give it up, and with a friend who is Dr. Porroy. This Dr. Porroy is a French doctor himself, but also much closer to esoteric and holistic ideas, and he had lived in Egypt in his earlier years. And then it turns out that actually Arthur Burden, the main character, also was raised in Egypt, and he had some occult influences and visions in his childhood, which he then completely forgot about, but now it comes back. They go to England, they try to recover Margaret from Oliver Haddo's castle, but it's too late. She dies, and Oliver Haddo escapes and eventually dies from this castle. And when they go to the castle, they discover a huge laboratory, and they see that Haddo was experimenting with life and wanted to create a homunculus. So here is the motive of the creating artificial life. But creating artificial life doesn't go by itself. It usually needs some life force, and in these literary fictions it is a human, living human being who is used by the magician for these purposes. Now, having surveyed these early models of kind of esoteric or occult-oriented fiction, we can introduce a new topic, kind of my typology, which classifies writers about the occult into three categories. There is the realist historicist, who is himself not an insider, and looks at the question of the occult as a historical, cultural, historical, or intellectual historical phenomenon, and tries to write historical novels recreating or recalling and of course commenting on this early modern esotericism and holistic world picture. A good example is by a French writer, Marguerite Yourcenar, who in 1968 published a novel called The Abyss, which is based on the characters of Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa. The main character is a quote-unquote historical character who lives in the early 16th century, and his life events are very similar, and his conflicts and his problems are very similar to that of Agrippa and Paracelsus. There's not much esotericism in the novel. It's more like it approaches this whole question that people were thinking, these people being magicians and esotericists, but actually they were just ahead of their time and tried to do scientific research and scientific experiments. After the realist historist, we can set up another category, which is the definite skeptic, who approaches the whole question with some sarcasm and I would even say a bit of hostility. Umberto Eco's famous novel, Foucault's Pendulum, exemplifies this attitude. Unfortunately, I won't have much time to talk about this novel. Maybe on another occasion we can go to a detailed analysis of that. But one thing should be mentioned by Eco's novel, that although it's not sympathetic to occultism and esotericism, it presents it in a very interesting way, and in a very faithful way, I would say, at least from certain viewpoints. And at the end, it manages to create such an ambiguity that in spite of his general skepticism, we cannot be absolutely sure about the truth. And I think that this is a good feature of fiction, that good fiction never feeds with a final solution, but always keeps the door open. Of course, Umberto Eco's first famous book was The Open Work. And the open work means that you can actually never exhaust the meaning of a great artwork. It always offers new and new interpretations. Now finally, the third type of writer using esoteric themes is the initiate, who is an insider, and with better or worse literary qualities, he kind of tries to fuse his or her ideas and beliefs into literary fiction. A good example for that is Mária Szepes, a Hungarian writer, a woman writer, who published many fascinating novels, and probably the best one is, which was published in 1947, called The Red Lion, The Elixir of Eternal Life, or The Story of Alchemy. It has various English titles, and it does have English translation. Again, I don't have time and the capacity to tell what this novel is about, but certainly it's a very well written, very interesting storyline, and basically it in a way brings us into that kind of thinking which proves the ideas and challenges of Western esotericism.